On the 1st of July 1961, Diana Spencer, the future Princess of Wales, was born. 3.5 years later, Britain's wartime leader, Winston Churchill, died. Though Churchill was born at Blenheim Palace, he was ultimately descended from the Spencer family of Althorp, where Diana had grown up. The pair were distant cousins within a dynasty that has hugely influenced Britain's history since the 16th century. How did the Spencer family emerge out of Althorp to have such a huge bearing on the country over a period of half a millennium? This is the story of the Spencer family, modern Britain's most influential aristocratic lineage. The origins of the Spencer family can be traced back to the 15th century, when John Spencer, a son of William Spencer, was born around 1455. This was the year that the ongoing instability around the reign of King Henry VI of England descended into open conflict, known as the Wars of the Roses. The Spencer family were members of the gentry at the time, and John's uncle was both a landholder at Wormleighton in Warwickshire and had acquired a lease of lands at Althorp in 1486. Althorp is in Northamptonshire in the English East Midlands. The pronunciation, Althorp, is the preferred one of the Spencer family, although Althorp is an alternative, more common pronunciation. The family were upwardly mobile in the 1470s and 1480s, despite the intermittent wars across England. They reared sheep on their estates, and the wool from these was exported to the Low Countries for processing as part of the textile industry there, activity which was central to England's export economy at the time. John succeeded his uncle at both Althorp and Wormleighton, first as a tenant and sheep farmer, and then as a landowner. In 1508, he used the small fortune he had made from being an industrious sheep farmer to buy the Althorp estate. In the 1510s, he continued to add to his landholdings, and in 1519, he was granted a knighthood by King Henry VIII on recognition of his ascent in the East Midlands. He died in 1522, and his estates passed to his son, Sir William Spencer. William died in midlife, and the Spencer lands passed to his young son, John. This younger John Spencer lived down to 1586 and built on the work of his grandfather to make the Spencers one of the foremost non-noble families in this part of England. He served as the Sheriff of Northamptonshire on multiple occasions between the 1550s and the 1580s. In 1579 or 1580, the youngest of his 8 daughters, Alice Spencer, married Ferdinando Stanley, the future 5th Earl of Derby, creating ties between the Spencers and the English nobility. Indeed, the Stanleys were related to the royal family and were potential heirs to the throne, given Queen Elizabeth I's unwillingness to marry and lack of an heir. Thus, the 16th century saw the Spencers emerge from being a wealthy family of sheep farmers in the East Midlands to become important local office holders, and then to marry into one of England's foremost noble houses. There is a debate to this day as to whether or not Edmund Spencer was related to the Spencers of Althorp. Edmund is widely considered, along with Sir Philip Sidney, to be the foremost poet of the English Renaissance. He was born in London around 1552 and was the son of a clothmaker who had moved to the capital from Lancashire. No definitive proof of his familial ties to the Spencers of Althorp has been found, but contemporaries, including Spencer himself, evidently thought he was related to Sir John Spencer. For instance, in his Tears of the Muses, published in 1591, Spencer dedicated the work to Alice Spencer and stated that part of his reason for the dedication was also some private bands of affinity, which it hath pleased your ladyship to acknowledge. In another of his works he affirmed that, though from another place I take my name, an house of ancient fame. Literary scholars also view this as being a reference to the Spencers of Althorp. Later, after Edmund's death, Sir John Harrington, a godson of Queen Elizabeth I and another poet of the era, addressed Sir John Spencer in his Metamorphosis of Ajax and stated, "You have a learned writer of your name. Make much of him, for it is not the least honour of your honourable family," which was clearly Harrington's way of saying Edmund was related to the Spencers of Althorp. There is no way of confirming this, but as well as rising up the social ladder in the English Midlands in the 16th century, the wider Spencer family was probably related to the greatest poet of the English Renaissance. While Sir John Spencer's daughters had been able to marry into the English nobility on account of his great wealth, the senior branch of the family became directly part of the aristocracy in the early 17th century. This occurred during the reign of King James I, the first monarch of the House of Stuart. James massively expanded the minor aristocracy as a means of generating increased revenue between 1603 and 1625. Sir Robert Spencer was one of the earliest beneficiaries of the inflation of noble titles when he was made first Baron Spencer of Wormleighton on the 21st of July 1603, 4 days before James's coronation in England. In advance of trying to acquire a noble title, Robert's father had acquired a genealogical pedigree from the College of Arms in 1595, which strangely tried to establish that the Spencers were related to the Despencer family that had become hugely influential in England back in the reign of King Edward II at the start of the 14th century. Historians today agree that the link between the Spencers and the Despensers was invented to bolster Spencer's attempt to acquire a noble title, but it was a strange connection to try to make in the first place, given that the Despensers were viewed as a malevolent force whose influence over Edward II largely caused a civil war in England. The newly ennobled Baron Spencer was clearly a wealthy man. At the time of his ennoblement in 1603, he was said to have an annual income of between £6,500 and £8,000, a sum which made him one of the wealthiest landholders in England in the early 17th century. He sat in Parliament on numerous occasions prior to his death in 1627 and was a middling figure in the politics of the period. In 1618, he was offered an earldom if he would pay the crown £10,000 for the title, but he turned it down, instead preferring to reinvest his fortune in further developing his estate. While the first Baron Spencer turned down the opportunity to become an earl, the family would not have to wait long for that more senior title to come their way. William, 2nd Baron Spencer, died in midlife in 1636, meaning that his teenage son, Henry, succeeded as the 3rd Baron just after turning 16 years old. His life would be short, but significant. In 1639, he married Lady Dorothy Sidney, a daughter of the 2nd Earl of Leicester, one of the country's most eminent peers. Henry and his new wife spent their first years as a married couple in Paris, where Dorothy's father was ambassador to France on behalf of King Charles I of England. When they returned to England in 1641, it was to a country on the brink of civil war. For years, Charles had been in conflict with his Scottish subjects over religious matters. This led to armed clashes from 1639 onwards, known as the First and Second Bishops' Wars. During the second of these, the Scots had come south and occupied Newcastle. Without control of that town's supply of coal to deliver fuel to London's fires, the capital went cold in the winter of 1640, and tensions escalated between Charles and his subjects. His efforts to convene Parliament after a long hiatus, with the only goal of acquiring a financial subsidy from them to raise an army, ended in disaster, while another rebellion broke out in Charles's third kingdom, Ireland, in October 1641. As tensions grew, the nobles of the realm picked sides. Henry Spencer became a royalist, though he was a moderate one and favoured a negotiated settlement to the developing civil war. Nonetheless, he fought at the Battle of Edge Hill, one of the first major clashes of the war when it did break out, for the king against the parliamentarians on the 23rd of October 1642. He was rewarded afterwards in June 1643 by being made first Earl of Sunderland by the king. Henry did not live long to enjoy the title. He was killed 3 months later at the Battle of Newbury. We just added a new desk to our office setup to help with our day-to-day editing. This is a standing desk from FlexiSpot, the sponsors of this video. The big advantage of these desks is you have the option to sit or stand. This helps enormously with comfort and usability. A previous employer of mine used these desks. He told me how they helped with fitness, comfort, and the ergonomics of desk use. Now that I've tried one myself, I can tell you he was absolutely right. They help alleviate strain, they help with circulation, and also help you stay active at work. These desks are stable and very well made. They are so flexible that whatever your height, you can find the right height for you. You can even sit on the desk while it's being moved into position with its 125 kilogram load-bearing capability. And whether moving or stationary, the stability of the desk is second to none. The lifting columns are built like precision joints, so the desk is powerful, efficient, and pretty much unshakable. You can store 4 heights with its smart controls, and its rock-solid legs are made from premium steel. If you are considering a change to your desk setup, then I would recommend you try the FlexiSpot. They are amazingly flexible. We tried the E7, which has a 15-year warranty and 30-day risk-free return service. Visit the website to see the E7 desk and the whole range of sale options they have. Just click the link in the description and use our promo code to save even more. The earldom now descended to Henry's son Robert, who had only just turned 2 years old. His youth at the time of his succession as Earl meant that he was the senior-most figure within the Spencer family for nearly 60 years down to his death in 1702. Therefore, the story of the Spencers is very much the story of Robert Spencer in the second half of the 17th century. He grew up in England against the backdrop of the civil wars ending in the defeat and execution of Charles I in 1649, and the creation of the Commonwealth headed by Oliver Cromwell, England's only short-lived experiment in republicanism. In 1658, he and his mother left England and went to live on the continent, where the House of Stuart and many of the royalist nobles were in exile, with Charles I's heir, the future Charles II, who spent the 1650s living between the Low Countries and the French court in Paris. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 and the accession of Charles II, Robert remained on the continent and travelled for several years. He returned home in 1665 and became a firm supporter of the monarchy. He served as an ambassador to France and Spain at various points in the years thereafter, while he also became a fixer when at home in England, employed to manage the king's various mistresses. Spencer managed to navigate the politically tortuous events of the late 1680s, when James II, Charles II's brother and heir, was overthrown on account of his Roman Catholicism and replaced by Mary II, James's daughter, and her husband, William of Orange, the preeminent political figure of the Dutch Republic. Through all of this, Robert became known as a great patron of the arts and of poets in England, and he was the antithesis of his ancestors in the 16th century. They had built up the family through their business and financial acumen. Robert was a spendthrift, and his lavish spending mired the family in debt. One of the projects which Robert spent a substantial proportion of his estate on was the construction of Althorp House. The older house here was far from being the grandest of England's country houses. Robert's ancestors had resisted the fashion to build great country homes in the 17th century, believing that it would waste a huge amount of their revenue. As a result, the seat was rather unimpressive. When the future Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo III, visited Althorp on a trip to England in 1669, he stated that he went down into the garden, in which, except some ingenious divisions, parterres, and well-arranged rows of trees, there is little to be seen that is rare or curious. Robert was determined to build a greater seat for his family, and in the mid-1680s, work began on Althorp House, which would become one of England's most renowned country estates. The house was built over a wider expanse, but it was not the tallest of English manor houses. The focus in the interior was the great staircase and the reception rooms, which the diarist and landscape designer John Evelyn claimed were befitting of a prince's palace after he visited Althorp. Huge double windows created a bright interior of the kind that was fashionable in the 17th century, as Europeans moved away from the narrow windows of the medieval past. The house has been added to and renovated over the centuries, but the core of it is still what Sunderland had erected in the 1680s. It is a Grade 1 listed stately home and one of England's most historic manor homes. Robert spent a period of time in exile in the Netherlands after Althorp was built, as he ran into political difficulties in the mid-1690s. After returning home, he died at Althorp in 1702. Nearly all of his 5 children died in their early adult years, and Robert was succeeded by his youngest son, Charles, who became the 3rd Earl of Sunderland. He was a politically significant figure under the first monarch of the House of Hanover, King George I. Charles, for instance, served as Lord Lieutenant or Viceroy of Ireland between 1714 and 1717, and held numerous senior government offices in England, notably spending several years as First Lord of the Treasury. However, he is primarily remembered today on account of his second marriage, a union which was politically consequential for the history of the wider Spencer dynasty. His first marriage to Lady Arabella Cavendish ended in 1698 when she died. Charles then married Lady Anne Churchill on the 2nd of January 1700. This was a politically important marriage, as Anne was the goddaughter of Anne of the House of Stuart, who became Queen Anne in 1702. Her mother was Sarah Jennings, a highly influential figure at Anne's court. She was also the wife of John Churchill, the Earl of Marlborough, who would soon become the first Duke of Marlborough and the most eminent noble in the realm during Queen Anne's reign. The marriage of Charles Spencer and Anne Churchill in 1700 was important, as it led to the development over time of 2 separate branches of the family: the Spencer line that continued to reside at Althorp House, and a separate Spencer-Churchill line that would live at Blenheim Palace and hold the more senior title of Dukes of Marlborough. It is worth backtracking here to consider the background of the Churchill family, since they would play a role in the dynastic history of the Spencers. Unlike the Spencers, the Churchills had not risen gradually as knights, barons, then earls and dukes. Instead, the ascent to the dukedom of Marlborough had been abrupt. The first Duke's father was Sir Winston Churchill, and his grandfather was John Churchill. John was born right around the start of the 17th century and became a lawyer. He prospered in London during the reign of King Charles I, and he initially supported the king in the Civil War of the 1640s, though he changed sides later on in it. His son, Sir Winston, was a young man in his early 20s when the conflict between king and parliament broke out, and he joined the Royalists. He was named after his mother, as John had married Sarah Winston. Hence the appearance of the name Winston as a first name in the family, was the result of the use of a maternal surname as a personal name. Sir Winston remained a committed royalist even after the defeat and execution of King Charles I. He was rewarded for his loyalty in the 1660s by Charles II after the restoration of the monarchy. By the time Winston died in 1688, his son and heir, John, had already established a reputation as a military commander for his role in the suppression of the Monmouth Rebellion that attempted to usurp the throne from King James II after his accession in 1685. This early show of loyalty aside, John later played a role in the Glorious Revolution, which removed James II from power in 1688 and ushered in the dual reign of Mary II and William III. As a reward, John was made the Earl of Marlborough. Marlborough's political ascent was not all smooth. In the early 1690s, he fell out of favour as suspicions grew that he was in contact with James II, who was in exile in France. He was eventually arrested and detained in the Tower of London in the summer of 1694 after accusations emerged that he had betrayed military plans to the French. However, the death of Mary II in December 1694 provided a window for the future Queen Anne to organise a partial rapprochement between Churchill and William III after John's wife, Sarah, implored her great friend Anne to do so. The accession of Anne in 1702 ensured Churchill's full reascent as a leading figure in English politics, while Anne also elevated him to the title of Duke of Marlborough. He became the country's leading military commander in the War of the Spanish Succession that raged between 1701 and 1713. This was fought between the French, Spanish, and Bavarians on the one side, and England, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia on the other, over the respective claims of the royal houses of France and Austria to the throne of Spain. On the 13th of August 1704, Churchill led a Grand Alliance army that defeated the French and Bavarians at Blenheim in southern Germany and prevented them from attempting to strike at Vienna. The victory sealed Marlborough's reputation as one of Europe's great military commanders, though he was never able to deal a decisive blow against the French in the war, which ultimately descended into a stalemate. Back in England, work began on Blenheim Palace as the seat of the Churchill family in 1705. It was only completed in 1722. Extraordinary investment by the Crown meant that Blenheim clearly has the look of an immensely impressive royal palace, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. This was the family which the Spencers formed a marriage alliance with in 1700. The first Duke of Marlborough barely lived to see the building work at Blenheim nearing completion. He died in 1722. Significantly, his son and heir, John, Marquess of Blandford, had died in 1703 from smallpox. An unusual royal dispensation was subsequently made to ensure that one of the Duke's daughters could succeed him as Duchess of Marlborough. Therefore, when he died in 1722, John was succeeded by his eldest daughter, Henrietta, who became the second Duchess. She lived down to 1733. 2 years earlier, her only son, William, had died from internal bleeding, probably caused by a ruptured organ when he was in his early 30s. What this meant was that the next person in the line of succession was Charles Spencer, the son of Charles Spencer, the 3rd Earl of Sunderland, and Anne Churchill, who had married in 1700. Hence, the younger Charles, who was born in 1706, became the 3rd Duke of Marlborough. He used the Spencer name, as did his son and heir, but the 5th Duke, George, would later adopt the dual surname Spencer-Churchill after he ascended to the title in 1817. This was in honour of his ancestor, the 1st Duke's formidable historical reputation, and also an acknowledgement of the peculiar dynastic dispensation that had been made in 1706 to allow the Marlborough title to continue through the female line. Hence, the branch of the Spencer family which continued to hold the Marlborough title and lived at Blenheim Palace are typically known as the Spencer Churchills. As we will see, at a much later time, members of the family dispensed with using the Spencer element of the dual surname altogether and became known simply as the Churchills once again. Althorp House did not continue in the Spencer Churchill side of the family. Instead, the ancestral seat of the Spencer family descended to a younger son of the 3rd Earl of Sunderland. This was yet another John Spencer. He was born in 1708 and inherited the Althorp lands in early 1734, after the full division of the joint family estate had been decided on. John lived down to 1746 as an eminent country gentleman and a long-standing Member of Parliament, but he did not acquire a title of his own. Instead, he was known simply as the Honourable John Spencer. John's alcohol problem caused his premature death, and his only son, also John, acquired the Althorp estate in 1746 at 11 years of age. By 1760, and by now in his mid-20s, John began petitioning the newly ascended King George III for his own title, arguing that he should be a member of the aristocracy, given his extensive landholdings, and that he was only deprived of a title because of the unusual circumstances that had led to his uncle acquiring the dukedom of Marlborough. The king accepted this, and in 1761 he was made Viscount Althorp, followed by the title of Earl Spencer in 1765. Hence, from 1765 onwards, there were 2 British peers descended directly from the Spencer family that had emerged out of Althorp in the late 15th century: Earl Spencer of Althorp and the Spencer Churchill Dukes of Marlborough at Blenheim Palace. The Dukes of Marlborough were clearly the more eminent branch of the family. The dukedom was held for nearly 6 decades by George Spencer, 4th Duke of Marlborough. He succeeded to the title in 1758, following the death of the 3rd Duke while campaigning on the continent during the 7 Years' War. Charles died after contracting dysentery, though his system was already weakened by consumption. His son's succession at just 19 years of age, and his long life down to 78 years, meant that he held the title for 59 years. Throughout that time, George held many senior offices and positions, though many of these royal appointments that had once been significant were by then becoming more ceremonial, as Britain transitioned to become a more fully fledged constitutional monarchy with power held primarily by Parliament. George was a keen astronomer, though he did not leave a major mark on Britain's history in the way the 1st Duke did, or like many of his descendants would. His son, the 5th Duke, might well have had the legacy of the 1st Duke in mind when he began to use the double-barrel name Spencer Churchill, but he certainly did not behave in a way which mimicked the golden age of the dynasty in the 18th century. Under his stewardship, down to 1840, the physical state of Blenheim Palace deteriorated, and the Duke was so spendthrift that he resorted to allowing people to hunt on the grounds at an hourly rate in order to raise revenue, while the courts were also intervening to stop him cutting down trees on the estate to sell for firewood. Affairs improved under subsequent dukes in the second half of the 19th century. At Althorp, the 1st Earl Spencer died in 1783 and was succeeded by his son, George Spencer, 2nd Earl Spencer. He lived down to 1834, so, like the 4th Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim, he dominated the earldom throughout the entire period of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and Britain's full ascent to become the world's foremost imperial power. Spencer played a role in these events. He was sworn in as a Privy Councillor in 1794 and became the Lord Privy Seal and the First Lord of the Admiralty the same year. This was an important accumulation of positions at the height of the French Revolutionary Wars, especially so since the British Royal Navy was so central to a war in which France's armies came to dominate the continent, but Britain remained in control of the world's oceans. Spencer has the peculiar distinction of having designed a jacket type that became very popular in the 1790s and 1800s and which was named after him. The Spencer or Spencer jacket was a long jacket that had the tails cut off and became more of a cardigan-shaped jacket. The Earl apparently asked to have the tails cut off his jackets by his tailors after the tails of one had caught on fire in his house. The design eventually influenced the mess jacket, which are still worn as double-breasted formal jackets at formal events in Britain and at traditional institutions like Eton College. The second Earl Spencer might have designed a famous jacket, but he was completely overshadowed in the social world of late 18th century England by his sister. Georgiana Spencer was born in 1757. On the 7th of June 1774, the same day that she turned 17, she married William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire. Devonshire was one of the wealthiest and most important aristocrats in Britain. The Cavendishes had intermarried with the Boyle family earlier in the 18th century, which had huge landholdings in Ireland stretching back to when Richard Boyle, 1st Earl of Cork, had built up an estate of over 100,000 acres in the south of the island, reputedly becoming the wealthiest man in Britain and Ireland in the process. The Cavendishes had acquired considerable wealth as a consequence, and their estate at Chatsworth House in Derbyshire became one of the great aristocratic centres in 18th century England. Georgiana's marriage into the Cavendish family became infamous. She was a celebrated beauty and a socialite of the era, but she was also notorious for her affairs and her gambling habit. Georgiana was also a major patroness of the arts and authored several books herself, while she also had an interest in the sciences. Though there is no doubting her intellect, her gambling problem became ruinous. By the mid-1780s, she had run up debts of more than £100,000, a sum equivalent to well over $10 million in today's money. She continued to add further to her gambling debts down to her passing in 1806, eventually resorting to borrowing large sums from fellow aristocrats and even the royal family. Georgiana would later be compared to her great-great-great-grand-niece, Diana, Princess of Wales, because of the tragic element of their lives lived in the public gaze. A film of her life, The Duchess, based on a biography by Amanda Foreman, appeared in 2008. Although it was a maternal line, the Cavendish family were descended from Georgiana and form a part of the Spencer family story. Her son, William, became the 6th Duke of Devonshire in 1811. He never married and was known as the Bachelor Duke. A noted horticulturalist, he employed Sir Joseph Paxton to lay out the elaborate greenhouse at Chatsworth House, which served as a later model for the development of the Crystal Palace in London that housed the Great Exhibition in 1851. William's status as a bachelor meant he did not have an heir, and the dukedom subsequently passed to another William Cavendish, a relative who was married to Blanche Cavendish, the granddaughter of Georgiana. Through that granddaughter, the modern Dukes of Devonshire are all descended from Georgiana, and are consequently descended from the Spencers. Georgiana also had an illegitimate daughter, Elizabeth, from her affair with Charles Grey, 2nd Earl Grey, who much later on served as Prime Minister of Britain between 1830 and 1834, a significant period in the country's history when slavery was banned and the Great Reform Act was passed. All of this indicates the interconnected world of the British aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the way in which the Spencers were related to many different prominent noble households. At Georgiana's home, Althorp House, John Spencer, 3rd Earl Spencer, succeeded to the earldom on the death of his father in 1834. He was well into his 50s by then, and had already had a distinguished political career. John entered the House of Commons in 1804 in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars when he was a young man of 22 years. He would sit in the lower house of Parliament for the next 30 years. He was not an especially accomplished speaker, nor was he known for being a man of major new political ideas, but what he lacked in these respects was made up for by his honest dealing. Contemporaries viewed him as a fundamentally reasonable politician, who both Conservatives and Liberals could trust. Hence, when Charles, Earl Grey, who was Georgiana's lover years earlier, became Prime Minister in 1830, John was made the leader of the House of Commons and also given the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. He consequently played an important role in negotiating the passage of the Great Reform Act through Parliament. His father's death in 1834 and his accession as the fourth Earl meant that he moved to the House of Lords, after which he largely retired from active politics. Honest Jack, as contemporaries called him, died in 1845. His wife Esther had died in childbirth in 1818, and John did not have an heir. Thus, the earldom descended to his younger brother, Frederick, a naval commander who had served with considerable distinction in both the later years of the Napoleonic Wars and the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Turks in the 1820s. The fourth Earl Spencer died in 1857 and was succeeded by his son John. The fifth Earl Spencer was born in 1835 and was a comparatively young man when he became the Earl. He had an important political career. He was a supporter of the Liberals, and in 1866, during John Russell's second term as Prime Minister, he supported Russell's plan to try to further reform the voting system to enfranchise a greater proportion of the population and remove more of the financial restrictions around voting. Russell was ultimately unsuccessful, and his government collapsed after less than a year. However, his successor as leader of the Liberals, William Gladstone, remembered Spencer's support in 1866, and when he became Prime Minister in December 1868, Gladstone rewarded him with an appointment as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Queen's Viceroy in Dublin. Spencer would serve there for the next 5 years, and he was reappointed for a second term between 1882 and 1885. This meant that Spencer was one of the most significant politicians in Ireland during a crucial period in the country's history. Liberal land laws were being passed during this time to try to redress the country's severe inequalities that had led to the devastation of the potato famine in the 1840s, and which had also created a massive wave of Irish migration to the Americas. Spencer was a supporter of land reform and even supported setting up special courts to coerce the country's major landholders to offer fairer rents to their tenants. His second term as Viceroy was shaped by the Phoenix Park murders, in which the new Chief Secretary of Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, who was appointed along with Spencer in 1882, was stabbed to death in Dublin a day after they arrived at the capital. Spencer consequently spent his second spell as Lord Lieutenant trying to curb the actions of Irish terrorist groups, while also engaging in much-needed reforms to redress political grievances in the country. Spencer, who was known as the Red Earl on account of the colour of his beard, later served as First Lord of the Admiralty between 1892 and 1895. He was considered a potential successor to Gladstone as leader of the Liberals, though that ambition was never realised. The Earls of Spencer and the Dukes of Marlborough were, of course, not the only members of the Spencer and Spencer-Churchill families. There were more junior members of the family in each generation that left their mark on the history of the period. Some even had more junior titles. Francis Spencer, a younger son of the 4th Duke of Marlborough, for instance, was made the first Baron Churchill in 1815, during the creation of new titles to mark the end of the Napoleonic Wars. His son, the 2nd Baron Churchill, served as a diplomat on the continent at the courts of Portugal and Austria in the 1820s. The second Baron Churchill's brother, Sir Augustus Spencer, was a military man who played an important role in the Crimean War. For instance, he led the 44th Regiment of Foot at the Siege of Sevastopol in 1854 and 1855. A cousin, Lord George Spencer Churchill, a son of the 5th Duke of Marlborough, had a military career on the continent too at a much earlier time. He served extensively in the Peninsular War, the British campaign against the Napoleonic occupation of Spain. Lord Alan Spencer Churchill, a son of the 6th Duke of Marlborough, was a businessman who became involved in shipbuilding at the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company, as well as playing a role in developing the English West Country as a tourist destination in the 1860s. On the Althorp side of the family, the children of the second Earl Spencer had colourful lives. His daughter, Sarah Littleton, became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria and acted as a governess in the household of the future King Edward VII when he was a child. Her brother George publicly converted to Catholicism and became a member of the Passionists with the adopted name of Ignatius. He spent his life trying to grow the Roman Catholic Church again in a country which was almost universally Protestant by the 19th century. He is a candidate for sainthood within the Roman Catholic Church today, after being given the title of Venerable in 2021 by Pope Francis II. In the second half of the 19th century, the Dukes of Marlborough were some of the most important nobles in the realm in terms of their seniority, but they certainly did not make as substantial a contribution to the nation's politics as did both the 3rd and 5th Earl Spencer. The 6th Duke of Marlborough, for instance, was known as a keen yachtsman, but not for much else. The 7th Duke, John Spencer Churchill, had a more distinguished career, though he turned down many opportunities. In a strange coincidence, he was offered the post of Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1874 after Benjamin Disraeli formed a new Conservative government. Had he taken the position, he would have succeeded his cousin, the 5th Earl Spencer. Instead, he demurred initially before taking up the post in 1876 and serving as Viceroy of Ireland until 1880. Although his influence over the country was not as substantial as his cousin's. More broadly, this emphasizes how the two sides of the wider Spencer dynasty had come to occupy the two different sides of the political divide in 19th century Britain. The Althorp-based Earl Spencers tended to be liberals, while Blenheim's Dukes of Marlborough were conservatives. The Dukes continued to support the Tories into the 20th century. The 9th Duke, for instance, was the Paymaster General and the Under-Secretary of State for the colonies in conservative governments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most important politician on the Blenheim side of the family in the 19th century was not one of the dukes. Randolph Spencer Churchill was a younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, but he was probably the most significant member of the Blenheim branch of the wider Spencer dynasty since the 1st Duke a century and a half earlier. Born in 1849, Randolph rose to prominence in the British Parliament in the mid-1870s. In 1878, he became a proponent of a form of independent conservatism after he launched an attack on the old guard of the Tories. In the 1880 to 1885 Parliament, he was known as a member of the so-called Fourth Party, a group of 4 Conservative MPs who attacked both the Liberal government led by William Gladstone and the Conservative Party leadership who formed the opposition. This led to Randolph becoming an early ideologue of what was then known as Tory democracy, but which is now more commonly called One Nation conservatism. Randolph's rise as a leader of the Tories was confirmed after the Marquess of Salisbury led the Conservatives back into government in 1885, and Randolph became Secretary of State for India and then the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Long before this, he had contributed to the revitalization of Blenheim and the family's finances by marrying Jenny Jerome, the daughter of a wealthy Brooklyn-based financier. She was one of the so-called Dollar Duchesses, daughters of wealthy American businessmen who married into financially struggling British aristocratic households in the Victorian era, swapping wealth for prestige and titles. Randolph and Jenny had 2 children together: Winston, born in 1874, and Jack, born in 1880. Winston, as we'll see, would become the most important British political figure of the first half of the 20th century. At Althorp, the 5th Earl Spencer was succeeded by his half-brother, Charles Robert Spencer, on his death in 1910. Charles continued the family tradition of supporting the Liberals and was made Viscount Althorp before he ever succeeded to the earldom, in order to allow him to become the Lord Chamberlain within the government of Henry Campbell Bannerman, the Liberal Prime Minister between 1905 and 1908. He was succeeded on his death in 1922 by his 30-year-old son Albert, 7th Earl Spencer. Albert was the defining figure at Althorp during the 20th century, as he lived to be 83 and held the earldom down to 1975. A veteran of the First World War, he played many important roles in the local government of Northamptonshire throughout his lifetime, including as a regional administrator during the Second World War. His son, John Spencer, would become the 8th Earl Spencer in due course. Long before then, he had married Frances Roche, a daughter of Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, a family with roots in Munster, the southern province of Ireland. John and Frances were married in 1954 and had 5 children. Sarah and Jane were born in 1955 and 1957. A son named John after his father died only hours after being born in 1960. Then, on the 1st of July 1961, a 3rd daughter named Diana was born. Their 5th child, another son, Charles Spencer, was born 3 years later, in May 1964. Diana would go on to become the most famous member of the Althorp Spencers during the 20th century. By the time she was born, the most celebrated member of the Spencer Churchills of Blenheim since the days of the first Duke of Marlborough, had lived nearly all of his life. Winston Churchill, as we have seen, was born in 1874 as the elder son of Randolph Churchill. He was, consequently, a grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. Winston's early career was complex. He spent time travelling the world at the height of empire, taking part in the Mahdist War in Sudan and the Second Boer War in South Africa at the end of the 1890s and the start of the 1900s. After returning to England, he began his political life with the Conservatives, but then he went against family tradition and crossed the aisle to become a member of the Liberals. His ascent through high political office was fast. In 1910, he was made Home Secretary, and then the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. His role in the disastrous Gallipoli expedition against the Turks during the First World War did not lead to Churchill's political decline, as is sometimes suggested. Instead, he continued to hold very senior offices after the war and through the 1920s, notably serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1924 and 1929. Churchill's wilderness years were really in the 1930s, when his warnings about the threat posed by the Nazis in Germany were deemed to be excessive, and he was outflanked by Neville Chamberlain in the race to succeed Stanley Baldwin as head of the Conservatives. Churchill had returned to the party in the mid-1920s as the Liberals declined as a political force in the wake of the rise of Labour. In the end, Churchill's warnings about the Nazis were proved to be well-founded, and he was made the wartime Prime Minister of Britain on the 10th of May 1940, the day the German invasion of France and the Low Countries began. The success of Churchill's wartime leadership is very well known. He galvanized the nation to resist the Germans in the dark days of 1940 and 1941, and was critical in the formation of the Allied alliance that eventually defeated fascism. Other elements of Churchill's career are often overlooked. He was, for instance, a formidable historian who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Arguably his most important work was a 4-volume study of the first Duke of Marlborough, the earliest sections of which dealt with the history of the Churchill side of the family, going back over many centuries. After Churchill's death in January 1965 at 90 years of age, it was several years before another member of the wider Spencer dynasty came to public prominence. On the 29th of July 1981, Diana Spencer, the daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer, married Charles, Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne and eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II. The marriage started out reasonably well. Diana and Charles seemed to like one another. She was commented on well by the media, and they had 2 sons quickly, William and Harry, born in 1982 and 1984. Thereafter, though, things deteriorated quite quickly. Both Diana and Charles were unfaithful, and by the end of the 1980s, rumours swirled in the media about infidelities, while their media appearances and royal trips together seemed more and more strained. Eventually, they separated in 1992, and they finally divorced in 1996, after years of media revelations. Diana died in a car accident while being chased by paparazzi through the streets of Paris on the 31st of August 1997. Barring some unusual development, her eldest son will succeed in future years as King William of the United Kingdom. There are many other members of the extended Spencer and Spencer-Churchill families that could be mentioned. The 9th Earl Spencer is Charles Spencer, Diana's brother. He succeeded to the earldom in 1992, following the death of the 8th Earl. Although he tends to feature in the media in conjunction with his sister and her memory, Charles is an accomplished historian who has written books on his own family and their ancestral seat at Althorp, as well as works on topics like the Battle of Blenheim and the fate of the men who signed the death warrant of King Charles I in 1649. Charles's heir, the future 10th Earl Spencer, Louis, is an actor. The Dukedom of Marlborough was held by the 11th Duke, John Spencer Churchill, between 1972 and 2014. His son, Charles James, led a much-publicised playboy lifestyle in the 1980s and 1990s, leading to efforts by the 11th Duke to place the future custodianship of Blenheim Palace out of his legal control. In 1995, Charles James was incarcerated briefly for forging medical prescriptions, one of 3 spells behind bars. He became the 12th Duke of Marlborough in 2014. Although he had largely avoided too much public controversy after becoming Duke, in December 2025, the 12th Duke, who is now in his 70s, was charged with several counts of strangulation of his second wife, Edla. They had divorced in 2024. Blenheim Palace is held and managed by a trust today, set up by the 11th Duke. The Spencer family are one of England and Britain's most storied families. Their origins can be traced back to Northamptonshire in the late 15th century, when John Spencer followed in his uncle's footsteps and became a successful sheep farmer at Althorp. This became the family's seat. John became Sir John in the early 16th century, while Sir Robert Spencer was made a baron in 1603 on the accession of King James I, on account of the family's wealth and power by then in the East Midlands. The earldom of Sunderland followed as a reward for the first Earl's loyalty to King Charles I at the start of the English civil wars of the 1640s. Later, the Spencers formed a marriage alliance with the Churchills, tying their mast to the rising star of late Stuart British politics, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. In the decades that followed, owing to his desire to ensure that a child of his own succeeded him, and because of his close ties to Queen Anne via his wife, Marlborough was able to have a legal provision made whereby his daughter succeeded him as second Duchess of Marlborough. This unusual dispensation led to the family dividing in the middle of the 18th century into the Spencers of Althorp and what became the Spencer Churchills of Blenheim Palace. In the 19th century, the Earls Spencer played a very senior role in the Liberal Party, while members of the wider Spencer-Churchill branch, like Randolph Churchill, became important Tories. The Spencer family reached the peak of its fame in the 20th century under the wartime leadership of Winston Churchill and via Diana Spencer's marriage to Prince Charles. If and when Prince William becomes King William, it will be as the descendant of the sheep farmer from Althorp who 5 centuries ago was knighted by King Henry VIII, beginning the remarkable story of the Spencers. What do you think of the Spencer family? Was this one of Britain's greatest aristocratic lineages, or were many of its members cursed by their ties to the richest and most powerful families of Britain? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.